May 1940, Berlin. In the heart of the Reich Air Ministry, Hermann Göring leafs through a Nazi intelligence report with disdain. The document describes a recent speech by U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt to Congress, proposing that the United States produce 50,000 planes a year. Göring laughs. He says that making airplanes is not like assembling cars, that Americans don't understand war, that its industry is civilian, its people are weak, its society is mixed and decadent. That laugh, uttered with the certainty of someone who believed he led the most advanced air force in the world, was about to echo in the void. In a few years, it would be swallowed up by an unprecedented industrial effort, a democratic production machine capable of manufacturing not 50, but 100,000 aircraft a year, while fighting 2 wars on 2 oceans. This documentary reveals how the technical and ideological contempt of the Reich turned into the biggest miscalculation of the Second World War. From the laughter of a marshal to the astonished silence in front of spreadsheets at Nuremberg, what rose was more than airplanes. It was the confirmation that democracy, when threatened, does not just react, it overproduces. But before we dive behind the scenes of this transformation, there is one statistic that defines this whole story. In 1940, the United States produced just over 3,000 military aircraft a year, less than a third of Germany's capacity. And yet, Roosevelt announced to the world that he intended to manufacture 50,000 airplanes annually. 4 years later, America has not only reached the goal, it has doubled. A single factory in rural Michigan, operated by civilians and women, produced more bombers than the entire German Air Force in the same period. What started as propaganda became the largest industrial avalanche in history, and the Luftwaffe couldn't breathe. If you value history, thorough research, and the power of facts, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps this channel to continue digging up the truths that arrogance has ignored. Berlin, May 28, 1940. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, maps of continental Europe dominate the room, marked with Nazi flags expanding rapidly westward. The German army advances through France in record time. The optimism is palpable. Sitting at the head of the table, Hermann Göring arrogantly examines a memorandum from Washington. The document summarizes a recent speech by President Roosevelt, declaring to Congress the need to expand airplane production to 50,000 units per year. Göring laughs out loud. His generals follow the derision with discreet smiles. They don't know what war is, he reportedly said, that they try to convert car factories into hangars. Building airplanes is not like building Ford Model T. That was not just a technical assessment. It was an ideological sentence. The Reich leadership believed that American democracy was weak, disorganized, and impure. They saw the United States as a mixed-race nation, dominated by Jewish capitalists and black workers, lacking the discipline or spirit of sacrifice that they said defined German superiority. This certainty was repeated in internal reports, speeches, and even military manuals. The Americans would not endure a long war, much less an industrial one. Ideology was not just rhetoric. It was a filter of intelligence. In the years before the conflict, detailed reports sent by Friedrich von Boetischer, the German military attaché in Washington, warned of American logistical capacity, the scalability of its industry, and the deep connection between the private sector and the government in times of crisis. In December 1940, Boetiker sent a direct telegram to Berlin. American war production will reach unimaginable levels. The notice was filed. Göring, like other Nazi leaders, believed that the war would be won with blitzkrieg, not with production spreadsheets. When Luftwaffe officers reported the beginning of civil mobilization in the United States, women entering factories, workers being trained in rotating shifts, the reaction was skeptical. Desperation, noted one analyst. Symbolic movement to keep morale high. No real impact. Racial prejudice and the doctrine of Aryan supremacy blinded the Nazi elite to the real threat, a society that, although diverse and disorganized in their eyes, knew how to adapt. In 1941, the Germans still believed that it would take the United States years to convert its civilian industry to a military one, and even more, they believed that the American people would not accept the sacrifice necessary. But the reality was different. By the end of 1942, American aircraft production was already more than double that of German production. In that year alone, the U.S. manufactured 47,136 military aircraft, compared to about 15,400 produced by Germany. This is the statistic that many within the Reich ignored, and that I now invite you to comment on. If this number surprises you, write down here, logistics wins, because that's exactly what started to happen. The German doctrine, built on speed, initiative, and local technological superiority, was not designed to face an enemy who could lose 10 planes in a day and manufacture 20 the next day. As late as 1943, the Luftwaffe was operating about 2,500 fighters across the European front. In the same year, the United States was producing on average 2,500 fighters per month. Göring wasn't just wrong. He was blinded by convictions that turned reality into a caricature. At the top of the Nazis, even geography was misinterpreted. Hitler even stated that the oceans would protect Americans from real war, that they would never have enough motivation to enter the conflict in a total way. But he ignored that the oceans, for a power with industrial and maritime dominance, would only serve as long-range logistical conveyors. Each new report coming out of the Atlantic, American convoys crossing the sea with thousands of tons of supplies, was relativized by Berlin as British exaggerations or propagandistic falsifications. The collapse of objectivity within Nazi intelligence made an accurate assessment of the American industrial threat impossible, and yet, the numbers continued to grow. The conversion of civilian factories into military units in the United States didn't just work, it created a new model. Each production line was treated as a battlefield. Each new worker was trained as a soldier of efficiency. Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, private companies became outstretched arms of the War Department. And across the ocean, the Luftwaffe still trusted that German discipline and the use of forced labor would trump any American attempt to get closer at scale. By 1944, it was already impossible to maintain the illusion. During the Big Week in February, American bombing raids hit German factories in depth, destroying production centers for fighters and critical parts. The Luftwaffe lost more than 300 aircraft in just 5 days. And the worst, more than 100 veteran drivers. Göring, confronted with the numbers, kept his speech. Quality will win over quantity. But there was no more quality to compete. The Nazi doctrine bet everything on a quick victory. But when the war became a contest of production, endurance, and logistics, Germany found itself on a terrain it did not dominate. And the United States, once seen as a sleeping giant, has begun to reveal the true size of its machine. In the next part, we will meet the man Roosevelt chose to lead this quiet transformation. A Danish immigrant who traded a millionaire salary for a simple uniform and a position without glory, but who would orchestrate the greatest industrial revolution ever recorded in wartime. On May 16, 1940, with France on the verge of collapse and German tanks crossing the Ardennes at relentless speed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the podium of the U.S. Congress with a proposal that few considered plausible, not even among his closest allies. "I would like to see this nation equipped to produce at least 50,000 airplanes a year," he said. At that time, the United States had manufactured only 3,611 military aircraft in the entire previous year. There were no stockpiles, structured air doctrine, and no trained manpower. The Army Air Corps had fewer than 2,000 operational planes, many of them obsolete. And even so, the president proposed to multiply the country's capacity by more than 14 times. The announcement was not just a war measure, it was a challenge to the imagination of the time. To make it real, Roosevelt turned to an unconventional figure, William Cygnæus Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen to the top of the American auto industry. A former president of General Motors, Knudsen knew the value of efficiency at scale. His domain was not combat but line time, the interval between screws, the turn of a factory per minute. Upon accepting Roosevelt's invitation to head the production effort, Knudsen turned down his salary of $300,000 a year and was paid a single token dollar. In return, he asked for complete freedom to deal directly with large American companies. He knew that winning that war would require something the Army did not know how to do: industrialize the urgency. His doctrine was clear. It was not a question of adapting industry to war, but of turning war into a manufacturing issue. Roosevelt understood the scale of the proposal, and unlike Germany, where war production was centralized under strict military command, the United States decided to bet on coordinated decentralization. The War Production Board, created to manage this gigantic gear, established partnerships with civilian factories in all states. taking advantage of the logistics network of the private sector, its capacity for innovation, and, above all, its speed. Knudsen knew that the United States would win not by tradition, but by quantity. He broke with the European model of verticalized factories and encouraged modular production, with scattered suppliers and a focus on interchangeable parts. Assembly lines were redesigned. Schedules were tabulated by the minute. What's more, while the Germans despised the use of civilians and women on the production lines, Knudsen saw in them a hidden reserve of strength and discipline. Throughout 1941, the planning took shape. New contracts began to emerge. Ford, which specializes in popular automobiles, was given the task of designing an assembly line for heavy bombers. General Motors took over engines. Douglas Aircraft expanded its capacity with new hangars in Long Beach and Chicago. What was at first a distant promise began to materialize in steel, aluminum, and schedule spreadsheets. Knudsen faced resistance, delays, logistical bottlenecks, and internal skepticism, but his conviction was technical, almost mathematical. For him, if a factory could produce a car every 2 minutes, it could also produce airplanes, as long as the tooling was redesigned and the assembly flow rethought. And that's exactly what started to happen. For the first time, civilian industrial logic would be applied on a full scale to war. By July 1941, monthly aircraft production had already exceeded 1,000 units. In December, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the country officially entered the war, and the growth curve became exponential. Between 1940 and 1944, aircraft production in the United States would grow 100 times. The 50,000 plan, which once sounded like propaganda, would not only be fulfilled, but doubled. What the Germans called the American illusion, in fact, was only the first cog in a machine about to be turned on. But not even Knudsen was prepared for what was to come next. Because in the middle of the Michigan plains, a new promise was taking shape. A factory so big, so fast, and so improbable that Reich himself would begin to suspect its existence. Her name, Willow Run, and his ambition was only one: to produce 1 bomber per hour. War came to Detroit without a single shot being fired. When Roosevelt and Knudsen decided to convert America's industrial heartland into a war arsenal, it wasn't just about building airplanes. It was about dismantling the culture of a civilian industry and rebuilding it under military discipline, absurd deadlines, and hitherto unthinkable goals. The task was colossal. Factories that had previously produced passenger cars would now have to manufacture aeronautical engines, complex airframes, parts with millimeter tolerances, and entire fighter planes. General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, companies accustomed to the logic of profit, became outstretched arms of the War Department. Instead of advertisements for chrome sedans, diagrams of fighters, turbines, and parts maps appeared. The first impact was chaos. At Ford plants, workers trained to assemble vehicles on the ground had to relearn everything: rivets, aluminum, aerodynamic structures. Entire lines were deactivated, tools had to be redrawn, and time was running against it. At Willow Run, the new plant built to manufacture the B-24 Liberator bomber soon faced its first collapse. The first plane produced was delivered completely out of specification and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Between 1942 and early 1943, production reports were worrisome. In February, Ford had promised hundreds of bombers but delivered only 56. The nickname spread. Will it run? Does it work? But mistakes have become school. Ford's engineers, led by Charles Sorensen, reacted with what they did best: standardize, divide, systematize. They broke the B-24 into 488,193 components and reorganized the entire assembly line into subassemblies. They developed hydraulic riveting tools, created pre-assembled electrical wiring harnesses, and transformed the process into something almost automatic. The line was redesigned based on the logic of car production, with each worker making a simple movement, repeated thousands of times. In a few months, the average assembly time dropped from weeks to hours. With each modification required by the fighting, new tools and workstations were adapted without interrupting the flow, a feat that the Germans, operating in vertical structures and bombed factories, were never able to replicate. But the biggest challenge was not only in the tools, but in the people. Civilians from the farms, housewives, mechanics, and even teenagers crossed the gates of these factories without ever having seen a plane up close. Most could not distinguish a wing from a rudder. In a matter of months, They were assembling bombers weighing more than 15 tons with an accuracy close to 99%. The cultural transformation was as profound as the technical one. The pride of serving on the assembly line replaced that of the uniform. Blue shirts of workers began to carry the same symbolic weight as the stars of the generals. Detroit has become, quite literally, the front line, and the numbers began to reflect this turnaround. By the end of 1943, Willow Run was producing more than one bomber per day. In December, it reached 365 in the month, and in April 1944, it surpassed the promise that seemed impossible: 428 bombers, one every 63 minutes. That factory alone produced more aircraft than the entire German aviation war effort that same month. The Reich, which had despised the ability of the Americans to assemble airplanes, now found itself fighting an assembly line that did not sleep, did not retreat, and did not stop growing. The Luftwaffe's analyses, hitherto skeptical, began to show unease. Pilots reported encountering increasingly dense formations, with bombers popping up in quantities that had previously seemed like propaganda. What they didn't know was that this was just the beginning, because while Ford was reinventing B-24 production, another plant on the other side of the country was preparing an even bolder leap: the creation of a bomber that would fly higher, farther, and with technology the Germans hadn't even prototyped. Its name was B-29, and its assembly line would be designed with a new principle: total modularity. The idea came like a whisper among engineers. What if it were possible to build a heavy bomber? For now. In 1941, this proposal would be seen as delirium in any general staff. But Charles Sorensen, Ford's head of production and a veteran of the Model T assembly lines, didn't just believe it. He engineered every detail to make it real. The site chosen was an old plantation in the interior of Michigan. Within a few months, Willow Run, the world's largest single-roof factory with more than 3.5 million square feet, was built there. The assembly line was so extensive that it ran through the county itself, and its winding layout was designed to circumvent a law that prohibited industrial construction beyond municipal lines. Production was organized in 3 continuous shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Each worker had a precise function. Each piece was transported in timed sequence, but the initial plan faced resistance. The first bomber, delivered in September 1942, had to be disassembled and reassembled in its entirety. The parts didn't fit, the quality standards fell short, and the project seemed to fail in the face of expectations. The press began to question the promise. Some politicians have suggested stopping funding, but Ford, true to its spirit of absolute standardization, did not back down. Sorensen responded by tweaking the tools, multiplying the inspection steps, and, above all, breaking down the complexity. The B-24, one of the most advanced planes of the war, was fragmented into modular sub-assemblies that could be assembled by any trained worker. Efficiency began to emerge from where there had been chaos before. By 1943, Willow Run was already delivering more than 300 bombers a month. In April 1944, the impossible happened: 428 units produced in 30 days. One bomber every 63 minutes. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them: applied production engineering with mathematical discipline. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. The scale achieved by Willow Run surprised even the Allies. British officers sent to monitor the project reported incredulity at seeing complete planes coming off conveyor belts. Some even doubted the durability of the bombers, but the tests proved otherwise. Quality improved as processes were refined. Lighter pneumatic tools, adaptations for women's hands, reduced ergonomic injuries. Every detail was recalculated to keep production uninterrupted. Meanwhile, Berlin received disconcerting reports about a legendary factory that was producing hundreds of bombers a month. German intelligence classified this data as exaggerations or propaganda, but the numbers were real. And the skies of Europe would soon be proof of this, because the first squadrons, made up exclusively of B-24s from Willow Run, were about to enter combat, and the Luftwaffe, until then master of the airspace, would begin to perceive a new reality. The war would not be decided by tactics, but by rhythm. As American planes took to the skies at increasing speed, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Reich's eyes remained closed. Since 1933, Friedrich von Bötticher had served as a German military attaché in Washington. With direct access to sources in the War Department, he closely watched the first signs of American industrial transformation. In December 1940, Bötticher sent a clear warning to Berlin: American war production will reach unimaginable heights. His reports were technical, based on factory visits, conversations with executives, and analysis of logistics trends. But his warnings hit ideological walls. For Göring, Himmler, and even Hitler, the United States was an ethnic patchwork, devoid of military spirit and addicted to bourgeois comfort. The Nazi conviction of racial and organizational superiority meant that any rational analysis was interpreted as pessimism or disloyalty. Bötticher's reports were labeled defaitistic, and in many cases shelved without discussion. The view was unanimous. Americans lacked fiber, could not withstand a protracted war, could not turn women and civilians into useful workers. This illusion found an echo in the Luftwaffe's reports. When informants began reporting the entry of hundreds of thousands of women into airplane factories, German analysts concluded that it was a clear sign of collapse. They are exhausted. They need to turn to women. Prejudice masked logic. The factories operating in 3 shifts were seen as a sign of chaos, a symptom of democratic disorder, the lack of centralization, the absence of a single command. However, it was precisely this decentralization that allowed for dynamic adjustments, quick responses to failures, and constant innovation. Reports also mentioned factories such as Willow Run in Michigan and reports about an increasing production of bombers. But the Luftwaffe leadership considered it impossible that heavy planes were being assembled as if they were automobiles. To them, this violated the logic of aeronautical engineering, ignoring that the Americans were, in fact, rewriting that logic in real time. At a confidential meeting in Berlin in early 1943, German generals discussed the possibility that American production had already exceeded 5,000 planes per month. The suggestion was dismissed with one sentence: they lie even to themselves. In the same month, the United States delivered 7,476 aircraft. The doctrine of German technical superiority, consolidated in the First World War and fed by the myth of the Prussian engineer, refused to accept that mass production tools operated by women, blacks, and immigrants were overcoming the technological heart of the Reich. Even when German pilots began to report the unusual growth of the American presence in the skies over Tunisia and Sicily, their observations were interpreted as field exaggeration. It was inconceivable to the high command that a country without military tradition would be developing superior air and logistical doctrines in less than 2 years. The result of this blindness was a fatal delay in countermeasures. While the Americans adjusted bombers in 60 days with direct feedback from the front, it took the Germans up to a year to authorize technical modifications to aircraft, even under direct fire. The military bureaucracy, combined with doctrinal rigidity, blocked any attempt at a proportional response. Germany still trusted that it would win by the genius of its engineers, not realizing that the war was now won by production schedules, assembly tolerances, and the ability to adapt en masse. For the Nazis, what was happening in the United States was an anomaly, but for Americans it was just an equation being solved in real time. And in the skies over North Africa, the first Luftwaffe pilots were beginning to realize this truth painfully. One major reported, "They were amateurs. Now there are many. Too much." In the next part, we'll look at when exactly that turn crystallized, the moment when the Luftwaffe finally recognized that the enemy wasn't just flying, was multiplying. The real engine of American industrial supremacy was not just the production belt, it was the one that operated it. When mobilizing for war required millions of hands, the United States turned to a resource that the Germans despised: its own people, in all their diversity. Rosa Munro, a factory worker at Willow Run, would become the icon of this invisible force. Known as Rosie the Riveter, she operated riveting machines with 99.5% accuracy, placing more than 3,000 rivets on B-24 airframes on her shift. She was no exception. She was the new norm. In 1941, women represented less than 1% of the workforce in the aircraft industry. By 1943, that number had jumped to 65%. More than 310,000 women were hired full-time for tasks that were previously considered exclusively male: engine assembly, quality inspection, wiring harness, painting, welding. Contrary to the Nazi narrative, which saw this mobilization as a sign of desperation, the data showed another reality. Accuracy increased, defects decreased, and productivity multiplied. Ford engineers began redesigning tools with smaller hands in mind, and the result was astonishing. Less fatigue, fewer accidents, more efficiency. Meanwhile, in Germany's underground complexes, enslaved workers died by the thousands, sabotaging parts, surviving starvation and brutality. The Reich war machine was fueled by pain, the American for cooperation, and the difference appeared in each piece produced. At Douglas Aircraft's plants, for example, female inspectors reduced failure rates from 3.2% to just 0.3%. It was the statistic that the Luftwaffe generals refused to accept, the fact that civilian women were delivering parts of a higher quality than the trained workers of the Reich. But it wasn't just women. African Americans, Mexicans, natives, European immigrants, and even teenagers filled the vacancies in the factories. Racial segregation still existed in much of the country, but in the face of the fascist threat, a new morality emerged, that of collective contribution. More than 1.5 million African Americans entered the industrial workforce during the war, many of them trained from scratch to operate high-precision machinery. In Long Beach, California, 22,000 women shared the factory floor with thousands of Latino and Asian workers. In less than 2 years, civilians who had never seen a dismantled airplane became masters of aeronautical construction. The force behind the production wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. It represented a society that, even with its internal flaws, could organize itself on a continental scale for a common goal. A society in which female workers wrote messages inside the wings of bombers, "Please return home safely." And these messages crossed oceans, wielded by machines manufactured by those who did not wield weapons. Germany mocked this mobilization. Their reports called American workers flimsy substitutes and predicted that production would collapse through lack of discipline. What happened was the opposite. The American assembly line became a moral front. Instead of punishment, there was engagement. Instead of forced labor, there were voluntary goals driven by bonuses, recognition, and, above all, a sense of collective duty. And when the need increased, the results followed. In 1943, American aircraft production exceeded 85,000 units annually. It was more than triple Germany's maximum capacity. And if the numbers were already impressive, what would come next would redefine the limits of the possible. A single factory at Willow Run could produce more bombers per month than the entire Reich effort combined. What the Germans called civil improvisation was about to become the largest mass production spectacle ever recorded. And in the next part, we will see how the Luftwaffe, faced with the mathematics of destruction, began to understand, too late, what was coming. In the skies over North Africa, at the end of 1942, German arrogance began to lose altitude. The Luftwaffe, which for years had reigned supreme over the European air, now faced a new reality over Tunisia. The first combats with American air forces revealed something that neither the Nazi command nor the pilots themselves were prepared to face: the superiority of mass production. Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected aces, recorded in his diary what he saw as the beginning of the end. American pilots are no longer amateurs. But the most disturbing thing is that there are more of them every day. It was true. At the start of the war in 1939, the United States had produced only 3,611 military aircraft. 3 years later, that number was already exceeding 85,000 per year. The B-17 and B-24 bombers now appeared in formations of hundreds, protected by fighters like the P-38 Lightning, completely changing the balance of power in the skies. The Luftwaffe still had good planes, good pilots, but it couldn't match the American math. For each plane shot down, another took its place in less than a week. The perception was brutal. While Germany lost between 1,200 and 1,500 planes per month, the United States produced up to 2,500 in the same period. If you were surprised by this difference, write in the comments, "Absolute power," or "Logistics wins." Because from here on, the air war ceases to be a dispute between tactics and becomes a matter of volume. The first American incursions into European territory began in January 1943. On the 27th, 64 B-17 bombers departed England to attack targets in the German city of Wilhelmshaven. It was the beginning of the strategic daylight bombing campaign, something the British considered suicide. But the Americans had another card up their sleeve: replacement capacity. When, in October of that same year, during the so-called Black Thursday in Schweinfurt, 60 B-17 bombers were shot down in a single day, the reaction was immediate. Within 2 weeks, the same number of aircraft were ready to fly again. It was a war of attrition, and the United States was ready to sustain it. The psychological impact among Luftwaffe officers was devastating. Internal reports pointed to a growing sense of powerlessness. In 1942, a German squadron could find 30 or 40 bombers in one mission. By the end of 1943, this number was approaching 300. In 1944, it would exceed 1,000. The Luftwaffe began to lose not only planes, but veteran pilots, irreplaceable, trained for years and now shot down by young Americans who were undergoing intensive ground training and simulation programs. In just 1 week of the so-called Big Week of February 1944, the Americans launched 3,500 bomber sorties over Germany, destroying factories, railroad lines, and logistics centers. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters, and more importantly about 100 experienced pilots, an irreversible loss. It was the turning point. Air warfare had ceased to be dominated by legendary aces and had become decided by production charts, assembly lines, and the flow of intercontinental logistics. General Adolf Galland reported to Göring in March 1944, "We are losing 100 or 200 fighters a month and producing only 1,000. They are producing 2,500 and losing only 400. It was an untenable equation. A logistical system that was already collapsing internally was now pressured by surgical strikes from the sky. On the ground, aircraft factories were bombed with increasing accuracy. In the skies, Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts swept through German fighters with extended range and speed. On paper, the Luftwaffe still existed. In reality, it was dissolving. What began as a promise of 50,000 planes a year, spoken with incredulity by Congress and mockery by the Nazis, had already become a real avalanche with undeniable numbers. And while Germany was desperately trying to hold the air front line, the United States was preparing for something even more ambitious, establishing absolute dominance of the air as a prerequisite for a ground offensive. The next phase of the conflict would show that air supremacy was not the ultimate goal. It was only the beginning. And in the next chapter, we'll look at how a single week of bombing in 1944 marked the moment when the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a functional force, paving the way for the most audacious landing in modern history. On October 14, 1943, the Bavarian sky darkened under the metallic shadows of 291 B-17 bombers. The target, the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, a vital point in the supply chain of the German aviation industry. It was the second offensive against the city that year, but this time without sufficient long-range escort. The Luftwaffe, still combative, launched 300 fighters to intercept. The result was brutal. 60 American bombers shot down in a single day. Nearly 600 crew members killed, wounded, or captured. The impact was immediate. German newspapers celebrated the victory. High-ranking officials declared that the U.S. air offensive was collapsing. But in the hangars of England and in Boeing reports, another reality emerged. In just 2 weeks, the same 60 bombers were fully replaced. Not by miracle, but by schedule. In the same month that Schweinfurt burned, factories such as Willow Run, Glenelg Martin, and Consolidated delivered 2,628 bombers. It was the mathematics of war taking over. Germany at that time struggled to produce just over 1,000 fighters per month, and these fighters were no longer flown by veterans, but by young people with only 160 hours of flight time, against Americans who accumulated twice as much. The Luftwaffe was still able to impose losses, but now the cost was sunk. Every German pilot shot down was a strategic loss. Every American bomber shot down was a guaranteed replacement. And the consequences were not just material. The psychological pressure on the German pilots increased with each mission, facing endless waves of B-17s flying in tight formation, with dozens of 50 caliber machine guns covering every angle, turned every intercept into an act of tactical suicide. More than half of the pilots sent to face the American formations between October 1943 and February 1944 did not complete 5 missions. Behind the scenes at the German Air Command, desperation was beginning to show. An internal memo drafted by Albert Speer in November said, "We are about to lose our breath. And losing the air in 1943 meant losing the ability to protect industry, transport, the capital. The offensive on Schweinfurt, despite the losses, marked the beginning of a new doctrine. The air war would not be won by perfection, but by permanence, by repetition, by the rhythm. The following year, the United States would drop more than 1.6 million tons of bombs on occupied Europe, and while the Luftwaffe emptied its hangars, Boeing opened new assembly lines in Seattle. The German sky, once a national pride, was now dominated by ruthless logic, and at the heart of that logic, a new aircraft emerged with an even greater ambition: to fly higher, farther with a double load, the B-29 Superfortress. Its impact would change not only the course of the war, but the fate of humanity itself. Between February 20th and 25, 1944, the skies of Germany became the scene of an operation whose name already anticipated its impact: Big Week. In just 5 days, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces flew more than 3,500 heavy bomber sorties against strategic targets in Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Leipzig, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and other industrial cities of the Reich. The operation was planned with a technical and symbolic goal: to destroy the Luftwaffe's production capacity, while at the same time forcing it to react, exposing what was left of its fighters and pilots. The answer came. The Luftwaffe released almost everything it still had: Focke-Wulf FW-190, Messerschmitt Bf-109, and even the rare Me-410 were put into action. But what was supposed to be a German show of force turned out to be strategic suicide. Each day of combat, Germany lost an average of 50 fighters, not just planes but its last veteran pilots. By the end of the week, it was estimated that between 350 and 400 Luftwaffe aircraft had been shot down. More than 100 pilots with combat experience were killed, a loss that not even the Reich, with all its engineering and discipline, could replace. The difference was brutal. While the United States trained about 50,000 new aviation crew members a year, Germany could barely graduate 10,000. And the training time was unparalleled. The Americans, with their standardized programs and flight schools spread across entire states, trained pilots in 7 to 9 months, with hundreds of hours of simulation and real flight. The Germans, pressured by shortages and the bombing of their own schools, had reduced this time to just over 3 months. The result was visible in the skies. American formations flying in close, radio-coordinated squadrons, supported by long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang, which could now accompany the bombers into the heart of Germany and back. On the other side, young German pilots, many under the age of 20, rushed into fighters that required skill, faced enemy formations that seemed to multiply with each mission. During Big Week, the targets were not only airplane factories but also engine assembly facilities, railroad hubs, and spare parts depots. Nazi aviation, which was already suffering from shortages of aluminum and fuel, began to live with the systematic destruction of its own rear. Factories in Leipzig were hit with surgical precision. Workshops in Augsburg ceased to operate for weeks. In Regensburg, the assembly lines of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 were interrupted indefinitely, and as sirens wailed on German soil, American strategists assessed the charts coolly. The goal was not to eliminate the Luftwaffe in combat, but to destroy its ability to continue to exist. General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, stated on February 26, "What we have done this week is to break the backbone of German aviation." On the same day, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, sent an internal note to the Nazi Chancellery: "If the pace of attacks continues, our air production will collapse in 2 months." Arithmetic was winning over ideology. The Reich, which bet on technical and moral superiority, now counted losses on charts that only pointed downwards. With every ton of bombs dropped, a piece of the Nazi war machine stopped working. And with each experienced pilot shot down, an entire generation of combatants was erased. The irony was unbearable. Germany, which had once laughed at the American idea of building 50,000 planes a year, now saw that figure surpassed and used against it, accurately, persistently, and mercilessly. But the biggest surprise was yet to come, because even in the face of air collapse, the Nazi high command believed it could resist. After all, the land invasion had not yet begun, and for that, it was necessary to cross the English Channel. In the next chapter, we'll look at how absolute dominance of the air paved the way for the largest military landing in history, and how the skies, already conquered by industry, became the veritable battleground that preceded D-Day. In 1944, the skies of Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The war ace Heinz Baer, with more than 220 confirmed victories, took off that morning with the awareness that times had changed. The mission was simple on paper: intercept a formation of bombers over Brunswick. But what he found when he reached 8,000 meters of altitude was something that no combat manual covered. The horizon was filled, not with clouds, but with perfectly aligned rows of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, advancing like flying ramparts. Among the formations, hundreds of fast, lethal P-51 Mustang fighters, ready to defend each wing with coordinated fire. Baer and his companions, only 8 Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, were flying towards the impossible. They were no longer fighter missions, he would say years later. They were sacrificial flights. In less than 10 minutes, 3 of his own were shot down. Another had to jump. The attack they managed to carry out was confused, disorganized, repulsed with machine gun fire coming from multiple angles. Baer's impression was clear. We weren't fighting men. We were fighting a machine. A machine that made aircraft faster than they could shoot them down, that trained pilots before their own even completed the basics, that bombed in daylight with relentless precision and volume. During that week, more than 1,400 American bombers crossed the skies over northern Germany. More than 15,000 tons of bombs were dropped, and while the Germans flew in small, desperate squadrons, the Americans replaced each downed plane with 2 new ones. The statistic spoke for itself. In 1944, the United States produced 96,318 military aircraft. Germany, in the same period, produced 39,807, and lost almost all of them in the air. Baer's account is more than memory. It is a tactical confession. We could take down 20 in one mission, but another 100 would come the next day. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of lightning war, now operated as a desperate, dehydrated containment force with no fuel, parts, or pilots. On many interception missions, German squadrons flew only 6 or 7 planes into the air. Most of the fighting lasted less than 15 minutes, and when they returned to base, the ones that returned, there were no parts to repair, no time to refuel. Officers like Galland and Milch tried to hide the reality with technical speeches, emergency plans, new aircraft still in prototype. But the pilots knew. Combat had become useless. Heaven now had an owner, and this owner was made of steel, aluminum, industrial cadence, and an ideology of volume. Fighting them was like throwing stones into a river. The current followed. One German commander likened the American air offensive to an industrial furnace. You can throw anything you want into it. Men, machines, resources, but it will keep burning. At bases such as Parchim and Wunstorf, the hangars were already empty. Those who still tried to resist did so with what was left. Inexperienced young men, patched equipment, and absent hope. The air war had turned into mathematics, and the Germans were in the wrong column of the equation. But if heaven belonged to the Americans, the earth was still German, and even with the factories bombed, the Luftwaffe destroyed, and the cities in ruins, the Nazi high command still believed it could stop the invasion. In the next chapter, we will see how dominance of the air became the first step in paving the way, not only for victory, but for the definitive entry of the Allies into the heart of Europe. While Germany sank into a spiral of scarcity, internal sabotage, and decisions made out of ideological pride, the United States operated in an ecosystem that seemed to come from the future. The key was not just to produce more, but to produce better, faster, and with the ability to adapt in real time. At the height of the war, an American aircraft could roll off the assembly line with completely different specifications than those designed 6 months earlier, all based on reports sent straight from the front. A misplaced bolt, a flaw in the armor, a suggestion from a sergeant who survived by inches. Everything was integrated into the production cycle with agility. Factories did not stop to adapt. They adapted in movement. One technical example says it all. In 1944, Boeing engineers identified flaws in the B-17's hydraulic system, with vulnerability to extreme cold over Germany. In 58 days, all the aircraft in the new batch left with improved thermal insulation. At the same time, the Germans were still struggling to homologate the Jumo engines of the Me-262 and needed to divert resources from other areas to do so. But nothing symbolized this difference more than the emergence of the B-29 Superfortress. Pressurized with navigation radar, remote-controlled machine gun turrets and intercontinental range, it not only surpassed any German design, it made the whole concept of tactical axis bombing obsolete. It was a plane that flew too high to intercept, too far to reach, and carried enough bombs to destroy entire factories with few passes. To put that in perspective, the B-29 was the most expensive plane of World War II. It cost more than the Manhattan Project. But while the Nazis designed planes that never left the drawing board, the Americans delivered nearly 4,000 units. And the most surprising thing, its production continued parallel to that of previous models, without interrupting anything. In a single month of 1944, the United States produced 7,694 combat aircraft. Germany, in that same month, produced 1,812. If this number surprised you, comment, "Logistics wins," or "shocking data," because this difference was not only quantitative, she was philosophical. While the Germans centralized technical decisions at political tables, the Americans decentralized everything into committees of engineers, workers, and pilots. The philosophy was simple: constant adaptation, active listening, flexibility. The U.S. factories ran in 3 shifts with predictive maintenance and belts that could be reconfigured in days, not months. An airplane could be re-engineered without ever moving off the line. The Germans, on the other hand, when trying to adapt the FW-190s to the new combat realities, had to stop production for weeks. The difference in operational culture defined the battlefield even before combat began. And when the pressure mounted, the Germans retreated to underground factories, hidden, unventilated, dependent on slave labor, and isolated from the rest of the system. The Americans, on the other hand, created innovation centers next to the factories. The design engineer sat next to the welder, the worker, the inspector. Each mistake became an improvement. Each combat, a practical lesson. The assembly line was the new front, and the war was decided by who reacted faster to the mistake. The Me-262, for example, was revolutionary on paper, a jet fighter with speed far superior to anything in the skies. But it took 2 years to become operational, and by the time it reached the battlefield it was too late. Parts were missing. There was a lack of special kerosene. There was a lack of pilots. In the United States, the P-51 Mustang was redesigned in record time, adapted for long-range flights, and delivered en masse before the Luftwaffe understood what had happened. It was a war between authoritarian improvisation and decentralized excellence. And the difference was not only in the machines but in the mentality. The Nazis believed that the war would be won by the superiority of the project. The Americans proved that it would be defeated by the speed of execution. And this execution was about to reach a new level. Because even with all the air dominance, the Allies still needed to put troops on the ground. And for that, they needed to build, in secret, the largest logistical apparatus in history. In the next chapter, we'll look at how the United States not only produced the planes, but the ships, the ports, the roads, and the supplies to move an army from one continent to another, and crush, inch by inch, the arrogance of those who had laughed at the impossible. With air superiority completely lost and urban centers under constant bombardment, the Nazi high command reacted as it had done before, retreating not only militarily, but morally. It was the beginning of the so-called Jaeger Project, a desperate attempt to decentralize war production by moving assembly lines to underground facilities. In all, there would be more than 729 hidden factories, dug under mountains, natural caves, and even abandoned mine tunnels. But behind the apparent engineering was a grim reality. About 60,000 prisoners were used as forced labor. Men, women, and children extracted from concentration camps and sent to work shifts around the clock, under dim lighting, poor ventilation, and minimal food. The goal was to produce without being seen. The result was the opposite. The fragmentation of the logistics chain, combined with the collapse of the railway infrastructure and the increase in internal sabotage, has caused these factories to generate more problems than solutions. Engines that exploded in test, electrical equipment that failed after minutes of use, screws changed intentionally. With morale in ruins and surveillance made impossible by scale, efficiency collapsed. In Mittelwerk, where the V-2 rockets were assembled, the failure rate reached 40% in the first shipments. In the production of the Me-262, made in multiple parts by units that did not always communicate with each other, the average time to complete an aircraft exceeded 1,500 hours. 5 times more than what it took to assemble a P-51 Mustang in the U.S. The irony was brutal. While Nazi propaganda extolled the power of German labor, it was the forced effort of subjugated peoples that kept the wheels running, badly and poorly. And even this effort, little by little, began to dissolve. From inside the caves came messages scrawled on pieces of wood, accidentally scratched pieces, components purposely misfitted. Each sabotage was a stifled cry against the totalitarian machine that now had to hide its own weakness behind the earth. On the other side of the Atlantic, the image was the opposite. As Germany sank into literal and symbolic darkness, the United States mobilized civilians who didn't just accept the war effort, they financed it. Millions of Americans bought war bonds with part of their salaries. Patriotic campaigns in schools, churches, and factories encouraged voluntary donations to fuel the production of tanks, planes, and ammunition. The comparison was untenable. While one system bet on fear and coercion, the other was based on the voluntary belief in freedom, and the production reflected that. In 1944, even with all the air collapse and the shift of production to caves, Germany produced 40,593 aircraft, half of the original Reich goal. The United States, in the same year, delivered 96,318, and these numbers don't count the difference in quality, training, maintenance logistics, or fuel availability. The difference was so wide that a secret British intelligence report sent to Churchill said, "The Third Reich is digging its own grave." Literally, the battlefield was now underground, but the war was decided above the clouds. And even in the face of this bleak scenario, the Nazis still believed that they could resist the ground invasion. After all, the Atlantic Wall was still standing, but it had never been built to withstand what was to come. In the next chapter, we will see how the planes produced in Detroit, the pilots trained in California, and the ships launched in New York would converge in a single dawn, and how American air supremacy would become the invisible shield of the largest landing in military history, June 6, 1944. When the first Allied paratroopers touched down on French soil in the darkness before dawn, the real impact came not from the boots that stepped onto the earth, but from the wings that tore through the sky. That morning, 11,590 Allied aircraft crossed the English Channel. Transport planes, gliders, fighters, heavy and medium bombers, reconnaissance and patrol aircraft. It was the largest air show in human history. On the other side, the Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German air terror, responded with only 319 sorties, less than 3% of the Allied force. It was the statistical chasm between a power that mocked the American ability to build 50,000 planes and an industry that was now dumping them on Europe as if they were rain. Every minute, 12 Allied aircraft took off from England. The sky was so congested that controllers had to establish air corridors by altitude, aircraft type, and mission. B-17 bombers dropped charges on fortified points. P-47 and P-51 fighters swept the roads, destroying any attempt at German reinforcement. C-47 transports dropped entire divisions with almost surgical precision, carrying more airborne troops in one night than the entire Luftwaffe had managed to move in 4 years of war. Air supremacy was so absolute that entire German units surrendered without a fight, shot down before they had even seen the enemy. Armored columns were destroyed before they left the forests. Bridges, supply routes, depots, and communication centers were pulverized in a matter of hours. The Atlantic Wall, built by Hitler with concrete, barbed wire, and bunkers, collapsed in the face of a synchronized bombardment that preceded each landing wave. An American pilot described the scene accurately. "We didn't invade France. We covered it in shade." As Allied soldiers advanced along the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, they knew the sky was theirs. And that was the differential. Each advance on land was protected by constant squadrons. Every German counterattack attempt was intercepted before gaining traction. The day's reports reveal that for every German tank destroyed on the ground, 2 had been disabled before they even reached the front. It was the doctrine of tonnage in its purest form. The power to crush the adversary not with isolated tactics, but with a logistics chain that spanned continents, combining intelligence, production, and large-scale delivery. And the numbers screamed. On D-Day alone, the Allies used 200 transport planes just to drop paratroopers, more than the Luftwaffe had available on the entire Western Front. In a single day, more than 15,000 tons of equipment and supplies were landed. Behind the scenes, American factories were operating at their absolute peak. Willow Run, Fort Worth, Seattle. Every hour, a new plane left the hangar. In many plants, workers worked with their eyes closed. So automated were the gestures. The effort was no longer just military. It was civilizational. And on the German side, silence remained. Luftwaffe radios became increasingly quiet. Pilots who managed to take off found skies taken over by enemy patrols, with no room for maneuver or retreat. Many returned even before completing the mission, if they managed to return. In his diary, a Wehrmacht officer wrote, "I never thought that the war would be decided by a factory, but it was." And on that June 6th, it was clear to the world that Hermann Göring's laughter in 1940 had echoed to the bottom of his own failure. Because when the idea of 50,000 planes was scoffed at, it wasn't just a goal, it was mocking a nation that had turned freedom into logistics. And this logistics was just beginning. In the next chapter, we will reveal how, after landing, the aerial avalanche turned into relentless occupation, and how every German city, road, and village came to live with the constant sound of the American engine. In May 1945, with the Reich in ruins and the Luftwaffe reduced to technical rubble, Hermann Göring, once the proud Reich Marshal, was captured by the Allies and taken to the interrogation center known as Camp Ashkan, housed in a luxurious hotel turned temporary prison for top Nazi leaders. There, far from the gilded rooms of Berlin and the flattery of subordinates, Göring found no more room for laughter. Faced with maps, reports, and production projections, he was confronted with the magnitude of the American effort. And something rare happened. Laughter turned to silence. A long silence, broken only by the questions of the Allied officers and the statistics that could no longer be denied. One of the interrogators, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thompson, recorded in his diary, "When we mentioned Willow Run, Göring stopped. He asked to repeat it. Then he asked, 'How many bombers per month?' The answer was clear. 428 B-24s per month in 1944. A single factory. More than the entire Luftwaffe could keep operational. And it wasn't a bluff. Ford's report was before him. Plant by plant. Line by line. The obsession began there. Over the next few days, Göring asked repeated questions about American production architecture. On the mats. About the shifts. About how civilians could work with such discipline. "Were they soldiers?" he asked. "No," the American officer replied. "They were volunteers. Workers." The interrogation notes show that Göring, already dejected, even stammered, maybe democracy works when she is furious." For a man who had spent years proclaiming the moral, racial, and technical inferiority of Americans, this was the most symbolic surrender of all. Not in front of a general, but in front of a factory. The irony of this story is that the solution was before him from the beginning, but she was ignored because she didn't seem heroic, because he didn't march, he didn't salute. It was made up of riveting machines, spreadsheets, union agreements, and coffee with donuts in late-night shifts. And even so, it produced what no dictatorship could replicate: efficiency with freedom. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because, as we shall see in the next part, Göring's confession was not an isolated case. Other captured officers, pilots, engineers, planners, described in detail the moment they realized the war was lost, and almost all of them cited the same sound, the constant roar of engines coming from the west. In 1944, as the skies of Europe were crisscrossed by endless formations of American bombers and fighters, the real battles behind that air supremacy were being fought on another front, a silent front, where the uniform was a grease-stained overalls, and the sound was that of thousands of tools operating in sync. It was the factory floor. And there, away from the general's spotlights and maps of operations, the most forceful moral response to Nazi ideology was formed. A workforce composed of everything the Reich despised. At Willow Run, more than a third of the workers were women. Many of them are young women, mothers, widows. Trained in a few weeks, they were operating with levels of precision superior to those of experienced workers in the pre-war industry. Inspection reports showed margins of error of just 0.8% in sections riveted by female crews, a standard that would become the benchmark for all Allied aviation. And they were not alone. Black men, until then segregated in civilian factories, took on technical and managerial functions. In Detroit, African Americans led entire shifts, overseeing the assembly of Wright Cyclone engines. Italian immigrants, Poles, exiled German Jews, Mexicans, Filipinos, refugees from the Spanish Civil War, all united by a task greater than themselves. Even workers with physical disabilities were integrated into adapted areas, something unthinkable in the rigid and eugenicist structures of the Reich. It was a civilian army that was not driven by hatred, but by purpose, and efficiency reflected this cohesion. Each shift, 2,500 components traversed the production belts, assembled by hands that Germany considered degenerate. The doctrine of German technical supremacy, based on racial purity and disciplinary rigidity, now faced an inescapable reality. It was American diversity that produced more, faster, with more quality. A Nazi engineer captured in 1945 stated in a tone of bewilderment, "They have no standard, but they have worked." And he was right. The logic of German segregation, which excluded millions of people from the war effort, had become a structural limitation. Meanwhile, the U.S. expanded its productive base by including those who had previously been ignored. Victory was no longer just numerical. It became moral. Each plane produced was also a silent manifesto against the idea that only the pure could win. And this directly reached the core of Nazi ideology. Because it wasn't just a defeat on the battlefield. It was practical proof that freedom, inclusion, and diversity could generate more strength than oppression and exclusion. It was the breaking of the myth of technical supremacy through industrial statistics. German spies, when reporting on the structure of factories such as Willow Run and Fort Worth, constantly underestimated their efficiency by judging the profile of the workers. Little did they know that this was precisely the advantage factor, and if military power is the extension of the structure that sustains it, then the defeat of the Reich began on the basis that it itself chose to ignore. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this moral and productive avalanche got a face, in the courtroom footage, in the confessions that came too late, and in the final numbers that sealed the irony. Americans didn't just reach the promised 50,000 planes, they built more than 100,000. And whoever laughed at it first was the last to understand. At the end of the war, it wasn't a general who sealed the fate of the Third Reich. It was a spreadsheet, a sequence of numbers so vast, so merciless, that it turned statistics into sentences. Throughout the conflict, the United States produced 295,000 military aircraft, Germany, 94,000. A difference of 201,000 aircraft, the equivalent of the entire air force of all the countries in the world in 1939, multiplied by 3. And it wasn't just volume, it was speed. At its peak, American industry manufactured a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. This means that while a German pilot was being trained, his mission was already being built, equipped, and sent to the front. Each month, more than 2,500 fighters, 3,000 engines, and thousands of tons of spare parts rolled off the American assembly lines. Douglas's plant in Long Beach, North American in Inglewood, Boeing in Seattle, Consolidated in Fort Worth, all operating at a military cadence but with civilian logic, fueled by a decentralized, flexible, and voluntary economy. The secret was not just in the steel, but in the system. The American method was modular, adaptable. Production lines were relocated in a matter of days. Feedback coming directly from the battlefield was incorporated into the next project without interrupting the chain. While Germany took months to adapt a new version of the Messerschmitt, the United States introduced weekly improvements to the Mustang. And the data didn't stop there. More than 812,000 aeronautical engines were produced. More than 697 million rounds of 50 ammunition. 35,000 heavy bombers. 40,000 transport aircraft. In contrast, in the last year of the war, the Luftwaffe could not keep even 15% of its fleet operating at the same time. There was a lack of parts, pilots, fuel. The collapse wasn't just military, it was structural, and the explanation was at the base. While Germany centralized decisions, stifled innovation, enslaved its workforce, and fragmented its logistics, the United States expanded its capacity with management freedom, economic incentives, and social union. Each worker was part of a cog, but also an agent of decision. Each industrial plant had the autonomy to optimize processes. Each error was corrected with transparency. The victory did not come from a miracle. It came from a method. And this method crushed Nazi ideology under tons of aluminum, planning, and cooperation. In 1944, the United States produced more aircraft than Germany, Japan, Italy, the USSR, and the United Kingdom combined. It was the greatest industrial disproportion ever recorded in any modern war, an avalanche so great that not even German bravery, Japanese discipline, or Soviet resistance were able to contain it. It was the mathematics of freedom, the final proof that democracy, when threatened, does not only resist, like it multiplies, and he organizes himself. In the next chapter, we will look at how this technical and logistical supremacy not only won the war, but shaped peace, and how the factory that Göring despised became the symbol of a new world. Because it's not enough to build 100,000 planes. You have to know what to do with the sky once you've conquered it. Hermann Göring believed that the war would be won by imposed will, by vertical order, by purity of command. For him, superiority was inscribed in the blood, in the rigidity, in the aesthetics of domination. Democracy, on the other hand, seemed to him a moral engineering error, loose, messy, fragmented. But as the Reich marched under drums and anthems, America lined up in silent lines at factory doors, with lunchboxes and aluminum helmets. And there in the warehouses of Detroit, Buffalo, Long Beach, and Seattle, the greatest fighting force the world has ever seen was being built, not by fiat, but by choice. There was no uniformity. There was plurality. Jewish engineers, Mexican workers, black supervisors, Italian mechanics, Filipino soldiers, blind volunteers, men with one arm. None of these people would have a place in Göring's hierarchy, but on the assembly line of democracy, everyone had a role. And it was this human structure, imperfect, noisy, diverse, that produced the 100,000 planes that buried the Luftwaffe. The irony is brutal. While Göring tried to model an empire on the myth of racial order, the creative disorder of the mixed people won by excess, for the collective agreement, for shared morality. The B-29s that tore through the skies at more than 9,000 meters didn't just carry bombs, they carried a system, a way of thinking, a way of living, and this mode had been underestimated from day one. What Göring did not see or refused to see is that democracy, although slow and conflictual, has a special kind of engine. It convinces rather than compels, and when convinced, no society is more productive, more adaptable, more dangerous. The P-51 Mustang, which escorted bombers to Berlin, was not born of a military decree, but of an urgent request and a private response. General Motors wasn't forced to deliver engines. It bet it could do better. Willow Run wasn't built to obey a central plan. It was designed to prove it was possible. Every technical victory was also a victory of method, and the sum of these decisions, made by thousands of free individuals, was worth more than any discourse of supremacy. In the end, the lesson that Göring did not understand, but the world learned, is simple. Freedom, when threatened, knows how to defend itself. And when it organizes, it doesn't just resist. It transforms workshops into arsenals, citizens into colossi, and ideas into airplanes. In the next chapter, we will reveal how this lesson did not end in 1945, because the American avalanche didn't just build airplanes, it built the world we're in now. And the question remains, who would dare to laugh again? May 1940 marked the beginning of a story that few could have imagined. Hermann Göring, in his arrogance, laughed at Roosevelt's plan. 50,000 planes a year? A number that he considered impossible, a product of American naivety. Nearly 6 years later, sitting in his cell at Nuremberg, in front of charts showing 295,000 US-made aircraft, he remained silent, unable to articulate what his eyes already confirmed. The war had not been lost by better soldiers, but by faster, more adaptable, more humane factories. American industrial supremacy crushed not only machines but also ideologies. The Reich, which believed in the superiority of race and authoritarian discipline, succumbed to the power of democracy applied to production, voluntary labor power, and collective coordination. This is the universal lesson that transcends World War II. Logistics determine strategy. Production capacity trumps tactical genius alone. Grand plans can be broken by production charts, assembly lines, and the sum of millions of free decisions converging in a relentless effort. As Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, put it, we were defeated by trucks, by assembly lines, by free men and women who worked together with faith and precision. This is the reality that transforms numbers into living history. If you were surprised by the magnitude of this industrial avalanche, support the research and the search for historical truth. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment on the most shocking data you discovered, and activate the bell so as not to miss the next devastating historical fact. But don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here from the channel with another amazing story, where we will explore how submarine warfare in the Atlantic, which seemed like Germany's total domination, was finally defeated by a combination of technology, intelligence, and mass production that redefined the concept of naval superiority.